Please, it hurts. I can't move, please.
You have made a very expensive mistake tonight. That is the second mistake you have made tonight. The first was coming here.
The third one. You will not live long enough to make it. Behind her, Han Jae-Wook stood frozen in the doorway of his own study, a gun still raised in his hand that he had not fired, staring at the wife he had married for her silence, not her strength. 3 years, he said quietly, and I never once saw this coming. You were never supposed to, Naomi said, wiping her knuckles clean with the edge of her sleeve. That was rather the point. I want to sit with that for a second before we go any further, because somewhere in this story is the exact moment a woman everyone dismissed decided she was done being underestimated, and I think a lot of you know that feeling better than you'd admit out loud. This story took me real hours to build, scene by scene, and it costs you nothing but a tap to make sure it doesn't disappear into the algorithm. So here's what I want from you. Predict it for me right now. Does she let him live, or does the room learn her real name tonight? Then tell me about a time somebody looked right past you and paid for it later. I read every single one of these. Drop where you're watching from. I like knowing how far this story has traveled. And if this is your first time in her world, subscribe now, because the woman who's about to walk into that room does not repeat herself twice, and neither will this story. Like this video before you go any further. Now, back to our story. The sun over the harbor had already burned off the morning haze by the time Naomi stepped into the private courtyard behind the estate, a cup of untouched tea going cold in her hands. The estate itself sat on 6 acres behind iron gates that Jae-Wook's grandfather had installed the year he arrived in this country with nothing but a name people had learned to fear. Naomi had grown used to the quiet of the place, the raked gravel paths, the fountain that ran even in winter. The way the household staff moved through the halls like they were trying not to wake something. Her husband, Han Jae-Wook, stood in the center of the training ring his men had built for him at the back of the property, stripped down to a plain black shirt, sparring gloves laced tight, watching his head of security demonstrate a disarming technique on a junior guard. Jae-Wook did not train for pleasure. He trained the way other men prayed, with total, unblinking discipline, every morning before the sun had fully cleared the water. Naomi had learned that much in 3 years of marriage, even if she had learned almost nothing else about the parts of his life that happened outside these walls. She watched him move through the drill twice, his footwork sharp, his focus absolute, and she let herself admire it honestly, because there was no version of loving this man that did not include respecting exactly how dangerous he was. Come and try, Jae-Wook called out to her, waving her closer with a rare, almost playful gesture that made the younger guards exchange amused glances. Just once. My men will not hurt you. Naomi laughed, the sound light and a little embarrassed, and shook her head, taking a small step back toward the stone wall, instead of forward into the ring. I would only embarrass myself in front of your men, she said, setting the teacup down carefully. I have never held anything more dangerous than a kitchen knife, and even then, only for Sunday dinner. It is not so difficult, Jae-Wook said, crossing toward her, his voice warm with the particular gentleness he reserved only for her. I could teach you the basics in an afternoon. Everyone should know how to protect themselves a little. Naomi wrapped her arms around herself, letting a small, convincing shiver work its way through her shoulders. I do not think my nerves could survive it, she admitted. Even watching makes my stomach turn. Jae-Wook's head of security, a broad, humorless man named Choi, tossed a training blade toward her feet as a joke, expecting the usual reaction, expecting her to step back the way she always did. She gave it to him, stumbling slightly on the uneven stone, her hands flying up in front of her face, a small, startled sound escaping her throat. The men in the courtyard laughed, not unkindly, and Choi even offered a short bow of apology, and Jae-Wook crossed the ring in 3 long strides to steady her by the elbow, his expression somewhere between amusement and concern. You are shaking, he said, something close to tenderness cutting through his usual composure as he studied her face. I forget sometimes that you did not grow up around any of this. Where I come from, Naomi said softly, letting her voice tremble just enough to sell it. We settle things with church socials and family dinners, not with knives. My mother would faint if she saw a blade anywhere near her dining table. Jae-Wook allowed himself a rare, quiet laugh at that, brushing a strand of hair back from her face with more gentleness than a man in his position had any business possessing. "Then it is decided," he said. "You will never need to settle anything again. That is what I am for." He turned to Choi without waiting for her response, his voice shifting instantly back into the flat, commanding register he used with his men. "From today she does not leave this estate without 4 men," he said. 2 in front, 2 behind. Whether she is going to the market, or to church, or anywhere else her friends might drag her. If anyone so much as raises their voice near my wife, I want to hear about it before she does. "Understood, boss," Choi said, nodding once, sharp and immediate. Naomi lowered her eyes in the practiced, grateful way of a woman who had just been generously protected, murmuring a soft thank you that made Jae-Wook's chest visibly loosen with pride, rather than a woman who had just watched her husband hand her exactly the cover she needed to move through his world unquestioned. 40 minutes across the city, in a warehouse that had belonged to the Baco Syndicate for 11 years, the floor was still wet with blood that had not finished drying, and the air still carried the sharp metallic smell of a fight that had ended badly for everyone involved. Jae-Wook stood over the bodies of 3 of his men, his jaw tight, his hands clasped behind his back in the particular stillness he used when he could not yet afford to show his men what he was actually feeling. "They came in through the loading dock," said a lieutenant named Park, his voice unsteady, his eyes not quite meeting his boss's. "No alarm, no warning, nothing on the cameras until it was already over. Whoever did this knew our rotation schedule down to the minute, boss. They knew exactly when the night shift would be thinnest." Jae-Wook crouched beside the nearest body, a young guard who had worked for him for less than a year, a guard whose mother Jae-Wook had personally promised safe passage for her son. "Survivors?" he asked quietly, not looking up. "None on our side," Park said. "But we found this near the east door." He held out a torn scrap of fabric, a patch bearing the crest of a rival family Jae-Wook had spent the better part of a decade keeping out of his ports through a combination of bribery, patience, and the occasional necessary violence. "The Calloway family," Jae-Wook said quietly, turning the patch over in his fingers, studying the stitching like it might tell him something more. "They have wanted this warehouse since before my father died, and they were never subtle about it. And now they believe they can simply walk onto my territory and take it while I am not watching closely enough." "They believe you are distracted, boss," said another man, older, careful with his words, standing near the back of the group where he could retreat if the observation landed badly. "A new wife, a quiet season, fewer patrols on the east docks than there used to be. They believe you have gone soft since the wedding." Jae-Wook stood slowly, the muscle in his jaw feathering, the scrap of fabric closing tight in his fist until his knuckles went pale. "Then let us remind them what my family does to men who mistake peace for weakness," he said, his voice dropping into the low, even register that made grown men in his organization go quiet and still. "Triple the patrols on every dock we hold, day and night both. I want eyes on every Calloway property in this city by morning, every warehouse, every restaurant they use to launder their money. Nobody moves without my order, but when I give it, I want them to understand exactly who they have provoked, and I want the Calloways specifically to understand it in a way they cannot pretend not to notice." By the time Jae-Wook's car pulled through the estate gates that evening, the sun had gone down hard and orange over the water, and the tension that had settled into his shoulders that morning had not eased even slightly through the entire drive home. He found Naomi in the sitting room, curled into a pale linen sofa with a novel open in her lap, a single lamp glowing warm beside her, the picture of a quiet evening that had nothing at all to do with him. She looked up and offered him the soft, easy smile she had perfected long before he had ever met her, setting the book aside without marking her page. "You look like your day carried the weight of the whole city," she said, rising to pour him a drink without being asked, already knowing exactly how he liked it. "It did," he admitted, dropping into the armchair across from her and accepting the glass gratefully. "Some men believe that because I have a wife now, because I have chosen a quieter life, I have lost my appetite for war. They are testing exactly how far that assumption will carry them." Naomi tilted her head, the picture of gentle concern, settling back into her seat across from him. "That sounds like a very foolish thing for anyone to believe about you," she said carefully. "Foolish men make the most dangerous mistakes," Jae-Wook said, swirling the liquid in his glass, his eyes distant, fixed on some middle point in the room that had nothing to do with the furniture. You would not understand it, Naomi. The calculations, the patience, the particular kind of violence that has to be measured out exactly right, or it costs you everything. Every dock, every man, every dollar we have built this family on. It is not a woman's burden to carry, and I would not want it to be. Naomi rose and crossed the room, kneeling beside his chair and resting her hand over his, her expression soft and utterly convincing, her thumb tracing gently over his knuckles. Then let it be my burden tonight to make sure you eat something and sleep, she said quietly, and let tomorrow carry its own weight the way it always does. Jae-Wook exhaled, some of the iron finally loosening from his shoulders for the first time all day, and he pressed a grateful kiss to the top of her head, entirely unaware that the woman comforting him had already counted every exit in the room without meaning to, and that somewhere beneath her nightgown, tucked against her thigh, was a blade 3 of his own men would not have known how to disarm. The boardroom at the top of Jae-Wook's downtown tower smelled of dark coffee and the particular tension that came from men who had not slept well in 3 days. Jae-Wook stood at the head of the long glass table, staring down at a map of the docks spread across its surface, red pins marking every warehouse the Callaways had hit in the last 72 hours. 6 of his men were dead, 2 shipments gone, a third of his eastern territory effectively contested. Park sat near the far end, jaw tight, refusing to meet anyone's eyes since the last briefing had gone so badly. "We cannot keep absorbing hits like this, boss," Park finally said, breaking the silence that had stretched too long. "Every day we wait, they take more ground. And every day we wait, more of our men start asking why." "We go to war then," said a younger capo near the window, leaning forward with the particular eagerness of a man who had never actually seen what a real war cost. "We have the numbers. We have the docks locked down tighter than they do. We hit them before they hit us again, and we lose a third of our own men doing it," Jae-Wook said evenly, not looking up from the map. "The Callaways are not stupid enough to fight fair, and a street war on this scale brings federal attention neither side can afford. My port contracts do not survive a shooting war splashed across every local news channel in this city." "There is another way," said a quiet voice from the back of the room. Every head turned. Standing near the shadowed edge of the boardroom was Elder Sue, the oldest man in Jae-Wook's organization, a man who had served Jae-Wook's father for 30 years before serving Jae-Wook, a man who spoke so rarely that when he did, the entire room stilled to listen. Jae-Wook straightened. "Speak, Elder Sue." Elder Sue walked slowly toward the table, leaning on the cane he had carried for as long as anyone could remember. "There is a place," he said, his voice carrying the weight of something almost reverent. "It has no fixed address. It moves, it changes hands, it appears only when the circumstances demand it. Every syndicate on this coast knows of it, even if most have never seen it with their own eyes. They call it the Widowmaker." Jae-Wook frowned, searching his memory and finding nothing. "I have never heard this name in 20 years of this business. Few outside the inner circles have," Elder Suh said. "It is not a restaurant, not a boardroom, not neutral territory in the way the old codes usually define it. It is an arena. When 2 men cannot resolve a dispute through negotiation, and neither side can afford the cost of open war, they are permitted to settle it there, body to body, under rules that cannot be broken. No guns, no blades unless both parties agree to them in advance. Just 2 men, and whichever one walks out decides the matter for good." The younger capo laughed under his breath, clearly unimpressed. "You want us to solve a territory dispute with a boxing match." Elder So did not so much as glance at him. "It is not a boxing match," he said, his tone hardening. "It is older than that, and far more absolute. The rules are enforced by someone who answers to no syndicate, no family, no code but her own. They say she has never lost a man who broke her rules to anything but the grave." Jae-Wook's eyes narrowed with interest despite himself. "Her," he repeated. "A woman runs it," Elder Sue confirmed. "No one knows her face. No one knows her name. She wears a mask when she presides, and the men who have crossed her rules were never seen again by anyone who cared to ask questions. I have heard it said the Genovese family lost a capo there 15 years ago for smuggling a knife into a match that was meant to be settled barehanded. Within a week, every family on the eastern seaboard had disowned him publicly, and within a month he was gone entirely. No one claimed the body. No one asked. That is the price of breaking her rules, and every syndicate I have ever known respects it absolutely, because none of them can afford the alternative. Jae-Wook considered this in silence for a long moment, turning the idea over the way he turned over every decision that mattered. If this arena is as absolute as you say, he said slowly, then a victory there against Calloway would end this the way no street war ever could. His men would have no grounds to contest it. His allies could not accuse me of an ambush or a massacre. It would be settled clean, in front of witnesses who answer to no one but the Widowmaker herself. That is precisely the appeal, Elder Saw said. But sanction does not come easily, and it does not come to everyone who asks. Then we ask anyway, Jae-Wook said, already turning the plan over faster now, already seeing the shape of it. Find out how this is done. It took 2 days and favors called in from 3 different brokers before Jae-Wook learned exactly how a man petitioned the Widowmaker for sanction. And even then, the process was deliberately, maddeningly indirect. There is no phone number, boss, said Choi, standing across from Jae-Wook's desk with a folder of notes that had taken considerable effort to assemble. No address, no email, nothing that could be traced or intercepted. You put out word through certain brokers, men who have earned enough trust over the years to carry a request without embellishing it or selling it to the wrong ears. You state your case plainly. You wait. And if she decides your dispute is worth her arena, she sends word back. If she decides it is not, you never hear from her at all, and asking twice is considered an insult that some men have not survived. Jae-Wook leaned back in his chair, studying the folder without opening it. And if I am not deemed worthy of her attention, then you go to war the old way, Choi said flatly, and pray it does not cost you everything you have built. Jae-Wook was quiet for a long moment. Who are these brokers? Old men, mostly, Choi said. Men who worked the docks back when your father was still building this family from nothing. There is one in particular, a man named Osei, who has run cargo insurance out of the harbor district for 30 years, who is said to have carried word to her personally on at least 2 occasions that anyone can confirm. Get me a meeting with him, Jae-Wook said. Today, if possible. It was arranged by early afternoon. Osei turned out to be a small, unhurried man with sharp eyes who did not seem remotely intimidated by the reputation walking into his cramped harbor office. You want an audience with her, Osei said, not quite a question, once Jae-Wook had explained himself as plainly as he could manage. Jae-Wook nodded once. I have a dispute that a street war would only make worse for every family on this coast, including my own. I would rather settle it under her rules than bury 100 more men proving a point the old way. Osei studied him for a long, unreadable moment, tapping one finger slowly against his desk. That is the correct answer, he said finally. Men who come to me wanting blood get nothing. Men who come to me wanting an ending sometimes get heard. I will carry your request. I make no promises beyond that. It is not my decision to make, and it never has been. That is all I ask, Jae-Wook said. Then go home, Osei said, already turning back to the papers on his desk in clear dismissal. And wait. The invitation arrived 4 days later, slipped beneath the front door of the estate sometime in the night, without a single member of Jae-Wook's security, noticing how it had gotten past the gate, which unsettled him considerably more than the message itself. It was a plain cream envelope, no name on the front, sealed with a single unmarked wax stamp. Inside was a single line of elegant handwriting, giving an address that did not exist on any map Jae-Wook's people could find, and a time, 3 nights from now, and nothing else. Choi read it twice over Jae-Wook's shoulder in the study, his expression uneasy. No confirmation of what happens there, no rules laid out in advance, nothing. Just an address and a time, Jae-Wook said, folding the letter carefully, and setting it on the desk in front of him. That is apparently how this is done. I do not like walking into anything blind, boss, Choi said. Neither do I, Jae-Wook admitted. But I like a street war against the Callaways even less. Prepare 6 men for the night of the meeting. No weapons beyond what we carry to the door, since I assume they will be confiscated the way Elder Sue described. And Choi. Boss. If anything about this feels wrong when we arrive, you pull me out immediately, sanction or no sanction. I would rather insult the Widowmaker than die proving a point to her. Understood, Choi said, though the tightness in his jaw suggested he was already running through every way this could go badly. That evening, Jae-Wook found Naomi in the kitchen humming quietly to herself while she plated dinner, entirely unaware of the invitation folded in his jacket pocket upstairs. "You seem distracted tonight," she said, glancing up at him with the easy warmth she always wore so effortlessly. "Business," he said simply, settling into a chair at the counter, and watching her move through the kitchen with a fondness that had only deepened over 3 years, entirely blind to how precisely she measured every step, every reach, every angle of the room, without seeming to think about any of it at all. "Something serious?" she asked, setting a plate in front of him. "Something that will be resolved soon, one way or another," he said, and left it there, the way he always did, certain she preferred not knowing the details of a world she had no place in. Naomi smiled, and reached across the counter to squeeze his hand, her expression soft and entirely convincing. "Then I will not ask you to carry it alone tonight," she said gently. "Eat first, worry after." Jae-Wook exhaled, some small portion of the tension in his shoulders finally loosening at her touch, entirely unaware that in 3 nights, the woman pouring his wine would be standing in the very arena he was about to walk into, wearing a mask he had never once suspected existed behind her face. The address on the invitation led to an unmarked warehouse at the edge of the industrial district, far enough from any main road that Jae-Wook's driver had to double back twice to find the turnoff. There were no signs, no lights beyond a single bulb over a steel door, just 3 black cars already parked in the gravel lot, engines cooling, exhaust still curling faintly in the cold night air. "Someone got here before us," Choi said quietly, scanning the lot as they pulled in. "That is likely Calloway," Jae-Wook said. He would not miss a chance to settle this in front of witnesses either. They stepped out into the cold. Jae-Wook straightened his jacket, and his 6 men fell into formation behind him without needing to be told. The steel door opened before they reached it, as though someone had been watching through a gap they could not see. A large man in a plain dark suit stood in the doorway, built like he had spent a lifetime absorbing hits meant for other people. "Names," he said flatly. "Han Jae-Wook," Jae-Wook said. "I was sent an invitation." The man studied him for a moment, then nodded once. "Weapons." "All of them." Jae-Wook reached into his jacket and produced a compact pistol, setting it into the man's open palm without hesitation. His men followed, one by one, blades and firearms clattering onto a velvet tray that had clearly seen this ritual 1,000 times before. "If anyone is found carrying steel or steel of any kind inside," the man said, his voice carrying no threat, only fact, "they will not be walking back out to their car tonight. That is not my rule. That is hers." "Understood," Jae-Wook said. The man stepped aside and pulled the door open the rest of the way. The space beyond was nothing like the warehouse exterior suggested. High industrial ceilings had been strung with rows of hanging lights, casting a low amber glow over a wide circular ring, marked out in chalk on the concrete floor. Folding chairs and old couches ringed the space, occupied by men Jae-Wook recognized immediately, faces from every syndicate along the coast, all of them unarmed, all of them watching the empty circle with the particular stillness of men who understood exactly whose house they were sitting in. Jae-Wook spotted Marcus Calloway across the room, seated with 2 of his own lieutenants, a thin, satisfied smile already on his face. "Han," Calloway called out, loud enough for the room to hear. "Did not expect you to actually show. Thought maybe married life had softened that spine of yours after all." "It will not be soft when I break yours," Jae-Wook said evenly, taking a seat near the edge of the ring. A hush fell over the room a moment later, without announcement, without a bell or a call to order. Every man present simply straightened, as though some shift in the air had told them what was coming. A woman in a plain black mask stepped out from a side door and crossed to the center of the ring. She was tall, composed, her presence alone enough to still the last murmurs of conversation in the room. "2 disputes tonight," she said, her voice calm and carrying easily across the space. "Han Jae-Wook and Marcus Calloway, territory along the eastern docks. You both agreed to bare-handed terms. You both understand what happens if those terms are broken." "We understand," Calloway said, rising and stripping off his jacket. Jae-Wook rose as well, removing his own jacket and rolling his sleeves with deliberate calm. "Then begin," the masked woman said, stepping back to the edge of the circle. "And know that I am watching every second of it." Calloway moved first, faster than his size suggested, driving forward with a hooking punch that Jae-Wook barely turned away from in time. Jae-Wook answered with a strike to the ribs that made Calloway grunt, but the man absorbed it and kept coming, backing Jae-Wook toward the edge of the chalk line. "You have gotten slow, Han," Calloway said between breaths, circling. "Married life does that to a man." Jae-Wook said nothing, conserving his breath, watching the rhythm of Calloway's guard for the gap he knew would eventually show. It came a moment later. Jae-Wook drove in low, caught Calloway across the jaw with a short, brutal elbow, and the bigger man staggered back, blood already welling at his lip. The room stirred with low murmurs of approval, the kind reserved for men who understood violence as craft. Calloway wiped his mouth, spat, and came in again, wilder now, less controlled, and Jae-Wook read the difference immediately. A man fighting with his pride instead of his training made mistakes. Jae-Wook ducked a wide swing, drove a fist into Calloway's stomach, followed it with a second strike to the temple that dropped the bigger man to one knee. "Stay down," Jae-Wook said quietly, not unkindly. "This does not need to go further." Calloway laughed, low and ugly, still on one knee, one hand braced against the concrete. "You think this ends with your fists," he said. "You think I came here to lose fair." He reached toward his boot faster than anyone in the room could react, and the dull gleam of a folding blade caught the amber light as he lunged upward toward Jae-Wook's throat. The room erupted into shouting. Jae-Wook twisted barely in time, the blade opening a shallow line across his forearm instead of his neck, and the force of Calloway's lunge sent them both crashing to the concrete. Calloway landed on top, the knife raised again, his face twisted into something no longer resembling a man settling a business dispute. "He is going to kill him," someone shouted from the crowd, and chairs scraped back as men rose, uncertain whether the rules of the room had just been erased entirely. Jae-Wook caught Calloway's wrist with both hands, straining against the weight bearing down, the blade trembling inches from his throat, his strength finally beginning to give. Then a figure moved through the crowd with a speed that silenced every voice in the room at once. Naomi crossed the space in seconds, still wearing the pale green dress she had worn to dinner that evening, and drove her heel down into Calloway's wrist with enough force to snap the blade from his grip before anyone fully understood what they were watching. Calloway roared in pain, twisting to face this new threat, and swung a fist wildly toward her. Naomi caught his arm mid-swing, turned her hips into the motion, and threw him bodily off of Jae-Wook, with a technique that took less than 2 seconds and left Calloway sprawled across the chalk line, gasping. The entire room stood frozen. Naomi did not look at the crowd. She stepped between Calloway and her husband, planting herself over the fallen man with an authority that made even his own lieutenants hesitate to move. "You brought steel into a bare-handed match," Naomi said, her voice cutting through the silence, calm and merciless. "That is not my husband's rule to enforce. That is mine." Calloway stared up at her, blood and confusion mixing across his face. "Who the hell are you?" Someone in the crowd near the back rose slowly to their feet, and their voice cracked with disbelief. "That mask? That is her stance. That is her voice." Another man near the ring's edge went pale, backing away instinctively. "It cannot be. She has been in the room this whole time." Naomi reached up and pulled the pin from her hair, letting it fall loose, and turned slightly so the amber light caught her face fully for the first time that night. The masked woman at the center of the ring lowered her head slightly, an unmistakable gesture of deference, and the entire room followed her lead a heartbeat later, dropping into a silence thick enough to feel. Jae-Wook stared up at his wife from the concrete floor, blood running from the shallow cut on his arm, utterly unable to reconcile the woman standing over him with the woman who had trembled at the sight of a training blade 3 days earlier. Naomi finally looked down at him, and something unreadable passed behind her eyes. "We will discuss this at home," she said quietly, and reached down to help him to his feet. The car ride back to the estate passed in a silence so heavy it seemed to press against the windows. Jae-Wook sat with a strip of cloth wrapped tight around the cut on his forearm, staring straight ahead, his jaw set in a hard line that Naomi recognized as the calm before something broke entirely. She sat beside him, her hair still loose from where she had pulled it free in the arena, her hands folded neatly in her lap, watching the harbor lights slide past the window. Neither of them spoke. Choi drove without a word, his eyes flicking to the rearview mirror every few seconds like he expected the silence to detonate at any moment. By the time they pulled through the estate gates, the household staff had already gone to bed, leaving the halls dim and quiet, lit only by the low glow of a few lamps someone had left burning. Jae-Wook walked straight through the foyer without waiting for her, his footsteps hard against the marble, and did not stop until he reached the study, where he finally turned to face her as she followed him inside. "You have 3 years," he said, his voice low and dangerously even. 3 years to explain to me who I actually married." Naomi closed the door behind her and met his gaze without flinching. "I am the same woman you married," she said. "Do not," Jae-Wook said, his voice rising sharply for the first time. "Do not. Stand there and tell me that. I have watched you flinch at a training blade. I have watched you claim you could not hold a kitchen knife without trembling. I assigned you 4 guards because I believed you needed protection. I did not need protecting," Naomi said evenly. "I needed you to believe I did." Jae-Wook stared at her, something raw moving behind his composure. "Why?" he demanded. 3 years, Naomi. Every dinner, every night, every time I told you things I have never told another living soul, because I thought you were the one person in my life who could not use them against me. I was never going to use anything against you," she said, her voice steady, unrepentant. "I married you because your name is loud enough to drown out mine. Explain that to me," Jae-Wook said. "Right now." Naomi crossed the room slowly, stopping a few feet from him, her arms folded, her chin level. "Your family is the loudest name on this coast," she said. "Every rival watches your docks, your warehouses, your wars. Every federal agent with an open file has your name circled in red ink. No one has ever once looked twice at your quiet wife who bakes for the church fundraiser and stays home while her husband handles his business." Jae-Wook's expression shifted from fury toward something closer to disbelief. "You used my name as cover," he said slowly. "For what? For years, men in this business have settled their disputes on the backs of women who never agreed to be collateral," Naomi said. "Wives sold off to seal alliances. Daughters used as leverage. Women who tried to leave and were made examples of instead. I built something to answer that, quietly, outside of every syndicate's reach, and I built it standing in the shadow of the one name, loud enough that nobody would ever think to look for it there." "The Widowmaker," Jae-Wook said. Naomi nodded once. "Every man who has ever broken faith with a woman he thought had no recourse has eventually found his way into my ring, one way or another," she said. "And every one of them has learned exactly how wrong he was." Jae-Wook was silent for a long moment, the fury in his shoulders not gone but reshaping itself into something he had not expected to feel tonight. "You built an entire war behind my back," he said finally, "and I never once suspected it." "That was rather the point," Naomi said, echoing words she had spoken once already tonight without meaning to. He studied her for a long moment, taking in the woman standing in front of him, stripped now of every soft pretense she had worn for 3 years, and found that the fury in his chest had begun, unwillingly, to twist into something closer to awe. "You could have told me," he said, quieter now. "Could I?" Naomi said. "Would you have let your wife walk into that ring tonight if I had asked your permission first?" Jae-Wook did not answer immediately, because he already knew the honest answer, and it shamed him enough that he looked away from her for the first time since they had entered the room. "No," he finally admitted. "I would not have." "Then you already know why I never asked," Naomi said, stepping closer, her voice softening slightly for the first time since the ring. Jae-Wook reached out and caught her hand before she could pull it back, turning it over gently to look at the same knuckles that had ended Calloway's knife hand less than an hour ago. "I do not know whether to be furious with you or in absolute awe of you," he admitted. Naomi allowed herself the faintest smile. "Perhaps you are permitted to be both at once," she said. Jae-Wook pulled her closer, the last of his anger finally giving way to something that had been building quietly beneath it for 3 years without him ever recognizing its shape, and for the first time since the day they had married, he looked at his wife as an equal standing beside him, rather than a fragile thing he had sworn to protect. 3 days after the arena, Jae-Wook was reviewing shipping manifests in his study when Choi burst through the door without knocking, his face pale. "Boss, the East Dock warehouse," Choi said, breathless. "Calloway's men hit it 20 minutes ago. 2 of our guards are down. They took the whole shipment." Jae-Wook was already reaching for his jacket. "He lost in that ring and he still thinks he can take from me," he said, his voice flat with fury. Naomi appeared in the doorway behind Choi, already changed out of the dress she had been wearing, now in dark, practical clothing that Jae-Wook was only beginning to understand was its own kind of uniform. "I am coming," she said. It was not a question. Jae-Wook looked at her for half a second, then nodded once, then moved fast. They arrived at the warehouse to find it half lit, smoke still curling from a small fire near the loading bay. 3 of Calloway's men working quickly to load crates into a waiting truck. Jae-Wook and Naomi split without needing to discuss it, moving along opposite sides of the building through the shadows. One of Calloway's men turned just as Naomi reached him, swinging a crowbar toward her head. She ducked under it, drove her elbow into his ribs, and used his own momentum to slam him face first into the side of the truck. Across the loading bay, Jae-Wook caught the second man from behind, wrapping an arm around his throat and holding until the struggling went still. The third man dropped the crate he was carrying and ran for the tree line, and Jae-Wook let him go, more interested in the 2 men left groaning on the concrete than in a chase. Naomi crouched beside the man she had dropped, pulling a phone from his jacket pocket before he could reach for it himself. "He was sending a location," she said, scrolling through the screen quickly. Someone was tracking whether this hit succeeded in real time. "Calloway?" Jae-Wook said, crossing to look over her shoulder. "Maybe," Naomi said, though something in her voice suggested she was not entirely convinced. They loaded the recovered crates back into Jae-Wook's own truck as the sun began to rise over the water, and Jae-Wook found himself watching his wife work with an admiration he no longer bothered to hide. "You fight like someone who has done this a very long time," he said quietly. "Longer than you have known me," Naomi said, without elaborating further. By the time they returned to the estate, word had already reached Jae-Wook that Calloway had gone quiet. No public retaliation, no boasting through his usual channels, which unsettled Jae-Wook more than an open declaration of war would have. "He is planning something else," Jae-Wook said that evening, pacing the study while Naomi sat calmly reviewing the recovered phone's messages. "He does not go quiet unless he is regrouping." 2 days later, the answer arrived in the worst possible way. Naomi's phone rang just after midnight, a number she did not recognize, and when she answered, a woman's voice on the other end was shaking too hard to speak clearly at first. "Miss Naomi," the voice finally managed. "It is Renee. They took her. They took Danielle." Naomi's expression shifted instantly, the warmth draining from her face and replaced by something colder, sharper. "Who took her?" Naomi said, already rising from her chair. "2 men," Renee said. "They knew her name. They knew about the ring. They said to tell you the Widowmaker does not get to hide behind another man's name forever." Jae-Wook, watching from across the room, straightened immediately. "Who is Danielle?" he asked. "A woman I helped get out of a marriage that would have killed her," Naomi said, already moving toward the door. "Her ex-husband works for the Calloways. This is retaliation aimed directly at what I built, not at you." "Then it is aimed at both of us," Jae-Wook said, following her. They traced the call to an abandoned processing plant 20 minutes outside the city, and Jae-Wook insisted on bringing 4 of his men, but Naomi stopped him at the car door. "If we come in loud, they kill her the moment they hear engines," Naomi said. "I need you to trust me on how this happens." Jae-Wook hesitated, every instinct in him built over 20 years demanding he lead with force. But he looked at his wife and made a decision that cost him more than she probably realized. "Tell me what you need," he said instead. Naomi allowed herself a brief, grateful look before her expression hardened back into focus. "You and 2 men circle to the loading entrance and wait for my signal," she said. "I go in through the side alone. They are expecting a woman coming to beg. I intend to give them exactly what they are expecting until I do not." Jae-Wook's jaw tightened, but he nodded. 10 minutes, he said. "If I do not hear your signal in 10 minutes, I am coming in regardless of what you asked." "Fair enough," Naomi said, and disappeared into the dark. Inside, 2 of Calloway's men held Danielle in a chair near the center of an empty processing floor, and Naomi stepped into the light with her hands raised, her posture deliberately smaller than her actual bearing. "Please," she said, letting her voice crack convincingly. "Let her go, and you can have anything you want from me instead." The nearer guard laughed, lowering his weapon slightly. Exactly the mistake Naomi had been counting on. "That is closer to what we were hoping to hear," he said. Naomi closed the remaining distance in 3 fast steps, disarmed him before he registered the shift in her posture, and dropped the second guard with a strike to the throat before Danielle had even fully processed that help had arrived. Jae-Wook and his men entered moments later at the sound of the struggle, weapons raised, only to find both guards already unconscious on the floor, and Naomi crouched beside Danielle, cutting through the rope binding her wrists. "We are safe now," Naomi said gently, helping the shaking woman to her feet. Jae-Wook lowered his weapon slowly, watching his wife with something between relief and reverence. "You did not need me at all," he said. "I needed you exactly where you were," Naomi said, glancing back at him. "Trusting me instead of leading with force. That mattered more than you know." It was on the drive back that Jae-Wook finally voiced the question that had been building in the back of his mind since the warehouse hit 3 nights earlier. "Calloway's men knew details they should not have known," he said slowly. "Your name behind the mask. Danielle's connection to you specifically. That is not information Calloway could have gathered on his own in 3 days." Naomi's expression sharpened. "You think someone talked?" "I think someone close to us talked," Jae-Wook said, his voice going cold in a way Naomi had not heard directed at anyone but an enemy before. "And I intend to find out exactly who, before Calloway gets another chance to use it against either of us." It took Choi less than a day to trace the leak, and what he found waiting on his laptop screen made him sick to deliver the news in person. "It is Park," Choi said quietly, standing in the study doorway. "Phone records show 3 calls to a Calloway number over the past week. One of them placed 20 minutes before the warehouse hit." Jae-Wook's face went perfectly still. The particular stillness Naomi had learned meant he was containing something enormous. "Park has been with this family 12 years, he said. "Money troubles," Choi said. "Gambling debts. Calloway found him first." Naomi watched her husband absorb the betrayal in silence, and reached for his hand without a word, and he let her, which told her more about how far they had come than anything either of them could have said aloud. "Where is Calloway now?" Jae-Wook asked finally. "His main compound outside the city," Choi said. "Sources say he is expecting a shipment tonight. Security tight, but not full war footing. He does not know we have found Park yet. Then we move before he does," Jae-Wook said, rising. Naomi was already checking the chamber on a compact pistol she had produced from somewhere Jae-Wook still had not figured out how she concealed so well. "I go with you," she said. "Not behind you, beside you." Jae-Wook met her eyes and nodded once. No argument left in him after the processing plant. "Beside me," he agreed. They approached the compound after midnight, moving through the tree line with 4 of Jae-Wook's most trusted men, Naomi and Jae-Wook at the center of the formation, reading each other's positioning without needing to speak. 2 guards at the east fence," Naomi murmured, crouched low beside him. "I see them," Jae-Wook said. "You take the left." She moved without hesitation, closing the distance in near silence, and dropped her guard with a strike to the base of the skull before he registered she was there. Jae-Wook handled the second a heartbeat later, and they scaled the fence together, dropping into the compound grounds in perfect coordination. Inside, Calloway was in the main house reviewing the night's shipment schedule when the first shots rang out from the perimeter, his security scrambling to respond to an assault they had not seen coming. Jae-Wook led the push through the side entrance, clearing the first room with brutal efficiency, while Naomi moved parallel through the kitchen corridor, dropping 2 more of Calloway's men before either could raise an alarm. "They are already inside," someone shouted from deeper in the house, and the compound erupted into full chaos, gunfire echoing through the halls as Calloway's remaining security tried to mount a defense. Jae-Wook took cover behind a heavy oak table as bullets chewed into the wall above him, returning fire with controlled, deliberate shots that dropped 2 men advancing down the hallway. Naomi moved through the chaos differently, closer, faster, using the tight corridors to her advantage where a gun became almost secondary to her hands. A guard rounded the corner directly into her path, and she disarmed him in a single fluid motion, using his own weapon to put down the man behind him before either had time to react. "Jae-Wook," she called out, Watch the stairwell. He pivoted just as a shooter appeared on the landing above, dropping the man with a single shot before he could get a clean angle on either of them. They converged near the center of the house, moving now as a single unit rather than two separate fighters, covering each other's blind spots instinctively, the way partners who trusted each other completely simply did. Calloway is in the study, Naomi said, nodding toward a set of double doors at the end of the hall. Together, Jae-Wook said, and they moved as one, kicking the doors open in perfect sync. Calloway was waiting for them, a pistol already raised, and standing beside him, to Jae-Wook's genuine devastation, was Park, his own gun trained loosely on the door. "Boss!" Park started, his voice cracking. "I did not want it to come to this." "Then you should not have sold my men to their deaths for a gambling debt," Jae-Wook said, his voice devoid of the warmth Park had known for 12 years. Calloway smiled through the tension, clearly enjoying the moment despite the danger. "Touching reunion," he said. "Shame it ends here for both of you." "He does not have the numbers left to win this," Naomi said quietly, her eyes flicking around the room, cataloging exits and angles the way she always did. "I do not need numbers," Calloway said. "I need one clean shot at the man who humiliated me in front of every family on this coast." Park's gun wavered between Jae-Wook and Naomi, sweat visible on his forehead even in the dim light. "I am sorry, boss," he said. "I truly am. Sorry does not bring back the men who died on that dock," Jae-Wook said. Naomi shifted her weight almost imperceptibly, a signal Jae-Wook had learned to read over the past week, without either of them needing words. "He is going to move first," she murmured, barely audible. Calloway's finger tightened on the trigger, and in the same fraction of a second, Park's resolve finally cracked, his gun swinging fully toward Jae-Wook, instead of hesitating any longer. "Now," Jae-Wook said. He and Naomi fired in the exact same instant, the sound of both shots merging into a single sharp crack that echoed through the study. Jae-Wook's bullet caught Park's center mass, ending 12 years of loyalty and one final betrayal in the same breath. Naomi's shot took Calloway through the chest, and he staggered back against his desk, disbelief written across his face as he slid to the floor beside it. The room fell silent except for the ringing in both their ears, gunfire from the rest of the compound already beginning to die down as Jae-Wook's remaining men secured the grounds outside. Jae-Wook lowered his weapon slowly, looking across the study at his wife, both of them breathing hard, both of them finally, fully, on the same side of every fight that mattered. "It is over," he said quietly. Naomi crossed the room and rested her head briefly against his shoulder, the adrenaline finally beginning to ebb. "For now," she said. By the time they returned to the estate, the sky had begun to lighten at the edges, the first gray hints of morning creeping over the water beyond the gates. Naomi guided Jae-Wook to a stool in the kitchen, insisting he sit, despite his protests, that the cut along his shoulder from the compound could wait until later. "It cannot wait," she said, already retrieving a small first aid kit from beneath the sink with the same calm efficiency she brought to everything else. "You have bled through your shirt twice already tonight and pretended not to notice." Jae-Wook watched her clean the wound with careful, steady hands, the woman who had ended 2 men's lives less than an hour ago, now working with a gentleness that felt like its own kind of armor stripped away. "You are very calm for someone who just lost a man she has known 12 years, he said quietly. "Park stopped being that man the moment he sold you out," Naomi said, taping the last of the bandage into place. "I am allowed to mourn who he used to be without forgiving who he became." Jae-Wook caught her hand before she could pull away, holding it against his chest for a moment. "And Calloway?" he asked. "Does that weigh on you at all?" Naomi considered the question honestly. "Not tonight," she admitted. "Perhaps tomorrow. Tonight I am only grateful you are still breathing in front of me." She moved to the stove without being asked, pulling ingredients from the refrigerator with the same unhurried focus she brought to everything, and within minutes the kitchen filled with the warm, familiar smell of eggs and toast, ordinary and grounding after a night that had been anything but. Jae-Wook watched her from the stool, still faintly disbelieving that the woman standing at his stove was the same one who had ended Marcus Calloway's life with a single, perfectly placed shot. "You never once let me see any of this," he said. 3 years, and I only ever saw the version of you that needed protecting." "That was never the real failure," Naomi said, setting a plate in front of him. "The failure was that I believed you could not handle the truth of me. Tonight proved otherwise." Jae-Wook set down his fork and rose from the stool, crossing the small distance between them, and for the first time in 3 years of marriage, he sank slowly to one knee in front of his wife, not as a proposal, but as something closer to an oath. "I built an empire on the belief that strength only looked one way," he said, looking up at her. "I was wrong about nearly everything that mattered most." Naomi's expression softened completely, the last of her guarded composure finally falling away. "You do not need to kneel for me," she said gently. "I am not kneeling because you require it," Jae-Wook said. "I am kneeling because you have earned it, and because whatever this family becomes from tonight forward, it belongs to both of us equally, not to my name alone." Naomi reached down and drew him back to his feet, resting her forehead against his in the quiet gray light of the kitchen. "Then let us build it together," she said softly. "No more masks between us. He killed for her tonight, watched her kill for him, and somehow it was this, an ordinary breakfast in a battered kitchen, that felt like the truest vow either of them had ever made. If tonight's ending hit you the way I hope it did, tell me in the comments whether you want to see what happens when the rest of the coast finally learns exactly who the Widowmaker married. Drop a like, subscribe if you are new to this world, and I will see you in the next chapter.